Sorry about that. I got interrupted. This is part two of language acquisition. We were talking about language mixing and looking at bilingualism. But really, around the world, people who are bilingual, language mixing is something that's completely normal. Doesn't mean that the child is confused. Doesn't mean that the child can't speak a language. It's more so that when a child grapples with the language, it's learning two vocabularies at once. So it's very interchangeable. The child is definitely not confused, and the child will learn, as you saw in the last video, to differentiate the different languages depending on their speaker. So, for example, a child that is growing up in an English context and a French context may use French words in an English syntax or English words in a French syntax. So, a child may say, his nose is perdu for his nose is lost, a house pink, so using a syntax of French on English words, or that's to me for that's mine. So there's different theories of bilingual language development. There's a unitary system hypothesis or the separate systems hypothesis. So the unitary systems hypothesis says that the child constructs only one lexicon and one grammar. But the reason why the children may have different sets of words is because they use these languages in different circumstances. And they acquire the vocabulary appropriate to each situation. So this is as if a Spanish child growing up in China may learn um, Chinese words at school, but at home you speak in Spanish. So you can only say Spanish words that pertain to the home, whereas all the academic context would be in Chinese. And this is true for me as well. My Cantonese is my native language, and I can only know words like cuss words and food words. And this is very typical of the immigrant experience, I think, of or immigrant children, of learning different words in the home that only pertain to the home. But I cannot, it's very difficult for me to talk about politics, religion, or something very, very academic in Chinese because I did not learn it in that kind of context. And then there's the separate systems hypothesis, which posits that the bilingual child builds these distinct lexicon and grammar for each language, and that the children they just automatically know which pathways to redirect the language. So, for example, they know that if a speaker is speaking Italian, they would automatically switch to Italian, or their speakers is speaking Arabic, they automatically switch to Arabic, and so they can adjust their language choice to whatever the addressee is. So, why the language mixing? Why do people code switch, right? So it could be that the child doesn't know the word in the other language, and so that they just replace the word, and so code switching becomes a um, crutch in order to help you articulate your meaning. It's more likely, I think, that this represents the grammars of the two languages working simultaneously, that these languages are so entwined and working together that people are able to code switch fluently because they know the language fluently. And so, someone speaking both English and Spanish may say things like, I put the forks in las mesas, or I put the forks on the table. Um, and so this is something that is very akin to people who are growing up in a bilingual circumstance. It's very, very, very normal. It doesn't say anything wrong about the child. Um, when we talk about code switching, what's the difference between mixing languages and borrowing languages? Um, Borrowing languages or borrowing words may be that, it's as if a squirrel is sitting on one tree but will eat the acorn from another tree. It doesn't mean that you're automatically fluent in a language. So, for example, the Taco Bell slogan, live Moss, right? So, Moss means more, and so, even if you know that word, it doesn't mean that you automatically know Spanish. You're just borrowing that term. Versus code switching may be something to where the child is able to jump back and forth between the two languages very fluently, in between the two trees, eating acorns from both trees, and using it in different circumstances. So, how much input and how early should a child learn a second language to learn it successfully? Well, the research is really mixed. The rule of thumb, though, is that as long as children learn the languages before puberty, um, they're more likely to retain the language and learn it fluently. And this comes from a lot of research, but it also comes from um, a lot of background into children who have been displaced. So, for example, there was a case of a young girl. Her name was Jeannie. That's not her real name, but it was a young girl who was, I think it was in the late 60s or 70s. She was forced and confined to like um, like a little potty chair until she was 13 years old, and so she never interacted with anyone. And after she was discovered, they tried to teach her language, and for the most part, even though she learned lots of vocabulary, she really didn't have a lot of good syntax. And she never really retained full control or full functionality of language, and that's because people think that it occurred before the critical period hypothesis, which posits that there's an age-related point beyond which it becomes difficult or impossible to learn a second language to the same degree as native speakers of that language. So the rule of thumb is if the earlier that you learn a language, the better, more you will retain that language. However, much of this is complicated by the fact that there are many, many, many different people who learn languages when they're older, like when they're 40s or in their 50s. My friend's dad learned German as an older person. He sounds exactly as a German person would speak with no accent and speaking that language. So there have been cases in which older individuals can use a language, but for the most part, if you want to learn a language and you don't want to have like an accented version of the language, the best time to learn a language would be before puberty. Are bilingual children more intelligent or more or less creative or cuter than monolingual babies? Well, there's no research on whether or not they're cuter, but bilingual children have better metalinguistic awareness, so they're able to kind of by switching back and forth between the two languages, they can understand the differences and similarities in between these languages. They have this conscious awareness of learning different languages, and so they're constantly using their brains in the left hemisphere of their brains. Um, Also, people would say there's been new research out there, and that being bilingual also helps to delay dementia. So they did a study on Canadians and bilingual Canadians in like the Quebec region where they speak English and French. And just growing up speaking two languages, you're constantly switching back and forth and using your brain so much that they say that this they're able to retain their brain a little bit longer using your brain in different ways. And of course, you can watch this video on the benefits of a bilingual brain. So these are the discussion questions. One, do you believe in the rational theory, children innately learn language, or the empiricist theory, children need exposure to the language? And you can use these theories presented in this PowerPoint and describe why. Or discussion number two, how do children's mistakes actively reflect ingenuity, so it's like cleverness, and linguistic creativity? Give examples of some language mistakes you or someone you know has made. How does code switching help or hinder one's language acquisition? And thankfully, no one interrupted me.